Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to show you my round 3 game from the Varsar Open. If you've seen the first 2 rounds, you'll know that I've had a very bad start to the tournament with a draw against a weaker opponent and a loss against a weaker opponent. And I haven't played well in the first 2 rounds. So obviously I wanted to change that. In round 3 I faced another lower rated opponent, which is normal when you start poorly. He's rated around 1700 and plays the King's Indian. So I started with pawn to d4. He went into the King's Indian, so we have knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, very standard stuff. And so far I've been playing e4 followed by bishop e2, bishop e3, the semi-Averbach, and continuing with pawn to g4. But I wanted to do something different in this game. I didn't want to keep playing the same thing over and over again, so I played the fianchetto variation. And the fianchetto variation is very interesting because it's unlike any other King's Indian. Basically, white has a bishop on the long diagonal as well as black, but in most cases white's bishop can be more useful. White doesn't have to play this position with e4 at all. Okay, so my opponent castled, I played bishop g2, he played d6, and this is still a million game. This is the main line with like 10,000 Grandmaster games. He played knight c6, which is normal, standard. You can play other moves too. I castled, and in this position a6 is the most common. And I think the most challenging move for white to face. You can also play the immediate e5. You can play rook b8, you can play bishop g4. There are many ideas here. My opponent went bishop to f5. And I think this is called the Spassky variation. I'm not sure. I usually call this the Spassky variation. So the idea behind bishop f5 is simply to develop the bishop and to prevent ideas like queen c2, and most importantly to prevent e4. So now we don't have e4. If we try to prepare it with rook e1, then maybe knight e4 or even bishop e4 are ideas. So you continue with d5. Oh, let me just remove variation arrows. Okay, so d5 is the most straightforward. You're preventing e5 by force, and e5 can be played later on, but it's always going to have the en passant option. It's always going to give white the option to go en passant. So that's something black has to factor in, especially if then black decides to undermine the center with c6, in which case d6 would be a very tender pawn. So it's very likely that black will not be able to play both. Okay, and in this position, my opponent played a move I'd never seen before. A move that's simply nonsensical in my opinion. He played knight b8. And knight b8 is a standard plan in the Bogo Indian. You go knight b8, d7, c5. Unfortunately, in this position, there isn't enough time to do that. The main line is knight a5. And after knight a5, this puts immediate pressure on c4. White plays knight d4. If c4 is taken, then the f5 bishop is taken, so that's really not good. The bishop retreats, and now b3. Okay, the knight is kind of stranded, but black has c5. And dc6, bc6, it could be captured in other ways too, and bishop b2. This is sort of the start of the variation. Black threatens to take on c4, we defend, and play goes on from there. My opponent played knight b8. And I was confused. I mean, I wanted to play knight d4 anyway, because I just get to play e4 once I chase the bishop away, so I played knight d4. I mean, I figured it couldn't be bad. And it turns out there have been 7 games from this position, and of course black played bishop d7 in all of them. My opponent went bishop c8, and now there are no games. So why is this bad for black? Well, it's bad because the knight went out, and the bishop went out, and they then went back. So if you compare the development, it's a huge lead in development for white. An extra developed piece, and it's not really clear where these 2 pieces can go. Of course, black's main plan should be a5, knight a6 in this position, but again, it's too slow. And that's the problem with the King's Indian. If you allow your opponent to misplace your pieces, if you allow your opponent to have more space and better development and a safer king, then you're in trouble. So okay, I played e4, the whole idea of the opening. My opponent played a5, which is understandable considering their setup. And this is one of the main sources of counterplay in the King's Indian, especially in positions where black doesn't have a pawn on e5 and this bishop is wide open. So if you can push this pawn all the way to a3, you will undermine the defense of this knight. In this case, there's a knight on d4 that's defended in front of the c3 knight, so that it doesn't really apply to this position. I played prophylactically here. I played h3, just preventing the bishop from gaining access to any useful squares. And it's a useful move because it also prevents knight g4, knight e5. Not that that would be too scary, but my c4 pawn is undefended, so I couldn't immediately play f4 because knight c4 would be possible. So h3 felt like a good idea. Knight a6, bishop e3. Also, by playing h3, I've enabled my bishop to go to e3 without having to deal with knight g4 a tempo. And in this position, he played knight d7. Another piece moving back, d4 is well defended, and both knights have access to e5 and c5, although e5 really isn't a good square because of f4. I just went rook c1 here, developing another piece, and that's a good move. He went knight a c5. And in this position, I played a strange move. I wanted to get rid of all the pressure on the queen side. So I played a suboptimal move, not knowing that it was bad, of course. I thought it was a good idea. The best way to play would have been to just continue f4, which is the most natural continuation. Black should undermine the structure with c6, something like dc6, and bishop d4 is the engine line. And the engine says white is significantly better here. Of course, the absence of the dark squared bishop is a huge deal. d6 will be a weakness if the e-pawn ever moves. And if our e-pawn moves, then c6 is simply hanging. So this is amazing for white. Instead, I played knight b3. I wanted to play strategically and prophylactically and just get rid of all the counterplay. So my idea is I'm just going to gain control over c5 by force. And if this isn't taken, then I'm just going to take twice and I'll have f4, e5, and so on and so on. So my opponent did take. And I made another mistake. The engine says take with the queen. That didn't even cross my mind. I took with the pawn automatically. Apparently queen b3, knight c5, queen c2 is the best way to play. But I took with the pawn, and this prevents a4. And on knight c5, I can go f4. I mean, why not? This was my intention. However, and the position is slightly better for white after my mistake with knight b3 and a b3. He played b6. I don't think this is a good idea. It's understandable because the bishop has 0 squares. Obviously, there are no squares. But even if it gets to b7 or a6, what's it doing? It's not doing anything. So b6 is kind of slow and kind of useless. Okay, finally f4. Bishop b7. And I played queen c2, connecting my rooks and reinforcing e5 and f5. And my intention was to continue with f5 actually, because I couldn't see what my opponent was going to do. Or if black doesn't do anything for another move, play rook e1 and retreat my bishop and prepare e5 slowly. But that was sort of a side plan. I was really hoping to play f5 at an opportune moment. But my opponent played e5 now. And I was shocked. So the only problem with f5 in this position, the only reason I didn't play it immediately, is the knight comes into e5 and blockades my position. So I'm not going to play f5 if the knight has e5. But when my opponent played e5, that means that the knight cannot occupy the e5 square. And now this knight is dead, this bishop is dead, this bishop is dead. So I just played f5. I mean, this is huge for me. I'm playing with at least 2 extra active pieces. You could argue that the knight could go to c5, but I don't have to trade it off, and it's really not doing that much on c5. My opponent played g5, which doesn't help matters. And this is an excellent example of what happens in the King's Indian defense when black doesn't have sufficient counterplay with enough open lines. Since I have that much more space, I can slowly prepare a breakthrough, and once it happens, there won't be any ways to defend against it. Okay, I played bishop f3, immediately claiming the diagonal. He went h6, which may be another mistake, and king g2. The idea behind bishop f3 was to bring my rook to the h-file. Of course, this move is a hook. This pawn is a hook. I'm going to go h4. And all I have to do is reinforce h4, and bishop f3 prevents g4 as a defense. It also prevents h5. And basically, what I want to do is double up my rooks down the h-file and break through. Once I break through, I'm going to sag the exchange on h6 and be winning. That was my plan. And believe it or not, that's what happened 20-something moves later. I took my time, but there was nothing my opponent could have done. f6, I mean, look at the bishop on g7. If it weren't on the board, it would make very little difference. Okay, it's defending h6, but still. Okay, so bishop h5, preventing any queen e8 ideas, defending the diagonal. I'm going to want to prevent h5, so queen e8 and h5, to make sure that on h4 there's no g4. So this is just the safest way to start. It's not like black has c6 or b5 or a4, even though the engine keeps playing one of those three pawn breaks because there's simply nothing else to do. But I still wanted to secure the king side and make sure that h5 can never be played. Okay, he played bishop c8. Rook a1. I played rook a1 first because I wanted to move my knight or my queen, or both, and I just wanted to prevent a4 in all situations, but then I changed my mind later. Bishop b7, he was just waiting, so rook h1, queen e7, rook h2, queen d8, doing nothing, rook ah1, queen e7. It's obvious that my opponent doesn't have a plan, and if you turned on the engine, I'll show you what an engine would play. The engine would play c6, and after h4, it would play cd5, ed5, and b5, giving up a pawn. Now, if cd5 is played, then my knight gets the e4 square. So that's the engine gives that the evaluation of +4, which is understandable, but it struggles to find counterplay, and this is a way to gain counterplay, even though it gives up a very important square and a pawn. But it's better than waiting to lose. So queen e7, doing nothing. Queen d1, I'm trying to bring my queen closer somehow. Bishop c8, bishop g6, that's fine. I wanted to get into a position where if he manages to play bishop d7, bishop e8, I can recapture with the pawn. h4 finally, knight f8, and I could have taken on g5 now, but I didn't want to risk anything, so I retreated my bishop back to h5, which is perfectly fine, still completely winning, but I could have taken on g5, and this pawn has to be recaptured, because if knight takes bishop, then I can just take on h6, and there are two pieces hanging, and my rooks are breaking through. Instead I went bishop h5, which is okay, bishop d7, now I took on g5, fg5, I played queen d2. This now prevents g4 in any circumstances, and it also threatens, in some cases, to take on g5. He played bishop e8, and in this position I retreated once again. So, and retreating wasn't good, taking was better, and sacking the exchange immediately. And I saw that idea, but I just didn't want to risk. I figured I had enough time, and I can, if I don't trade pieces, I'll have time to sack on h6 when I feel like it. The engine just cold-bloodedly does this. Just takes, bishop takes, rook takes, and says black is busted, which I agree with. My pieces are too good, and I'm just going to break through. Or I have broken through. Okay, but I played bishop d1. My opponent played queen f6, and in this position I missed an extremely good plan and actually allowed my opponent to almost equalize. So this, I feel, was the most instructive position in the entire game. So pause the video and create a plan for white if you want an exercise in attacking chess. Okay, so what I did here was I played g4. And g4 is +1.5. It's okay, but I just went from +3 to +1.5 because my plan really doesn't work that well. My plan was to play knight e2, knight g3, and then knight h5. When I did that, my opponent took and was almost equal. So even though g4 in itself isn't a blunder that allows my opponent to equalize, going for this plan almost did. I only had a slight advantage at one point, so a very bad plan. Instead of that, here's a plan. Transfer the knight to g4, and there's no resisting that. So I want to go knight d1, knight f2, knight g4. Once that happens, I have an additional attacker in play. I have the option to go f6, and black is busted. So moving the bishop anywhere, g4, f3, e2, anywhere. Let's say bishop f3. I don't know what black does. Let's say knight h7, and now knight d1. Again, I don't know what black does. The engine says a4. Let's just ignore that. Knight f2. Let's say takes on b3, and now knight g4. And there are no moves. The engine says queen f8 +5. And I just take on h6, and they've broken through. I did not see that. I did not see the idea of bringing the knight to g4. I should have seen that. Instead, I played g4 and tried to bring the knight to g3, which was a mistake. Knight h7 doing nothing, knight e2 continuing with my plan, rook a6, knight g3, rook a8 doing nothing, and knight h5 going from +1.5 to +0.7. Why? Because after bishop takes, rook takes, it becomes much harder to break through, and my opponent could actually safely get away. I was wrong in assuming that black's king is stuck in the corner. So black can just go king f7 here. I mean, why not? Why shouldn't the king run away? It's not like I can break through on the queen side. Imagine this position with the king, let's say on b7, rook's doubled up on the h file. That's it. I don't have a way to break through. I didn't even think of that. So for example, I don't know, queen f2, let's say I try to bring my queen in, queen e7, queen g3, knight f6, now I have to take, takes, there's nothing here. I don't have anything here. I mean, I'm gonna win the pawn, maybe, but still. So, knight h5, huge mistake. Bishop h5, rook h5, and my opponent played rook a6, which isn't precise. It just doesn't do anything, and he'd sort of lost his chance to try and equalize. And in this position, I could have done something else, but I decided to just bring my queen in and triple up on h6, and that's a good plan. So rook h2, rook d7, queen e1, he waits, and queen h1, and now I'm ready to break through. And it's at this point that the game was very hard for my opponent to navigate. The only move to stay above +3 or +4 was rook f8, and after rook f8 I cannot break through so simply, even though it's not too hard either. The engine says if I take, it's about +1 and I'll be fine, but the best way to continue is to wait with the king, like king f2, queen d8, king e1, bring the king to safety. I don't know what black does, let's say, I don't know, queen e8. Black doesn't really have a good plan. And then the engine plays rook 5 to h3 and sort of shuffles around until the eventual breakthrough after rook f8, because it doesn't see a clear way forward. I would have taken at some point. But after queen h1, my opponent played king f8. And now all the sacrifices just work, because the knight is undefended, the g6 square is weak, and it's just rook h6 wins the game on the spot. he has to take. If he doesn't take, I take the knight. So takes, tempo on the queen. It doesn't matter where the queen goes. He went to g7, which loses in a couple of moves. If queen f7, for example, then rook g6. And again, let's say king e8. I just take on g5. The knight can never take because of queen h8 followed by rook g8. It doesn't matter. In the game, he played queen g7. And that doesn't help at all. The knight's defended, but I have rook g6. The queen went to h8. It's very hard to suggest a different move because on anything else I'm just going to take. So the queen went to h8 and now bishop takes g5. The knight cannot take because the queen hangs. He played rook g7 and I played bishop h6 and he resigned because he's losing material. He's losing a full rook or the queen and the game is completely busted. So I think the most instructive point was here. This plan of transferring the knight to g4 is just amazing. I did find it when I was analyzing the game without the engine, and then the engine said that it's in fact the best plan. But it took me a long while, and I was trying to, the way I did it was I was trying to defend as black, and I actually couldn't find a way to lose after that exchange on h5. So I'd almost messed this game up. But luckily for me, I didn't, and I managed to win. Okay, if you play the King's Indian, good luck against the Fianchetto. I honestly think that the King's Indian is one of the most comfortable openings to play d4 against, and I've been enjoying it a lot. Let me know what you think. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.